Moines, Iowa, shouldn't they have to at least report to the FDA the name of the product and the ingredients? It is not required by law now. Please give the FDA this extra information to keep
Time has
America
expired.
safe.
Mr. President,
Senator from Iowa.
I move to table the Durbin Amendment and ask for the ayes and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka. Okay, gotcha. Mr. Alexander. To table? Ms. Ayotte. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Begich. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bingaman. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Brown of Massachusetts. Mr. Brown of Ohio. To table. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. To table. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Dement. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. What? I got him. Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein. Mr. Franken. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Grassley. Mrs. Hagan. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heller. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hutchison. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inouye. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johans. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Coons. Mrs. Murray. White House. Mr. Kerry. Mr. Kirk. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Cole. Mr. Kyle. Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Lautenberg, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Lieberman, Mr. Lugar, Mr. Manchin, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Levin, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson of Nebraska, Mr. Nelson of Florida, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island,
You want to be aye?
Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Snow, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Mr. Webb, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Senators voting in the affirmative: Akaka, Alexander, Ayotte, Barrasso, Begich, Bennett, Brown of Massachusetts, Brown of Ohio, Casey, Chambliss, Cochran, Collins, Coons, Corker, Cornyn, Crapo, Dement, Enzi, Graham, Grassley, Hagan, Harkin, Hatch, Heller, Hoeven, Inhofe, Inouye, Isaacson, Johans, Johnson of Wisconsin, Johnson of South Dakota, Kyle, Landrieu, Levin, Lieberman, Lugar, Manchin, McCain, McConnell, Menendez, Merkley, Moran, Murray, Nelson of Florida, Paul, Risch, Roberts, Rubio, Sessions, Shelby, Snow, Stabenow, Tester, Toomey, Udall of Colorado, Vitter, Warner, Whitehouse, Wicker, and Wyden. Mr. Burr. Mr. Burr, aye. Mr. Coburn, aye. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Blunt, aye. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mr. Lautenberg. Mr. Lautenberg, aye. Mrs. Feinstein. I have Senators voting in the negative: Bingaman, Boxer, Conrad, Durbin, Feinstein, Gillibrand, Leahy, Pryor, Rockefeller, Sanders, and Webb. Mr. Reed of Nevada, no. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coates, aye. Ms. Murkowski. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Udall. Mr. Udall of New Mexico, aye. Mr. Franken. Mr. Franken, no. Mrs. Shaheen. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Ms. Mikulski. Ms. Mikulski, aye. Ms. Klobuchar, no. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, no. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee, aye. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Cardin, no. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Nelson of Nebraska, aye. Mr. Kerry, aye. Mr. Carper. Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Baucus, no. Ms. Cantwell. Ms. Cantwell, aye. Mr. Cole. Mr. Cole, aye.
3.5 minutes.
Mr. Portman. Mr. Portman, aye. Mr. Lautenberg. Mr. Lautenberg, no. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Schumer, no. Mrs. McCaskill. Mrs. McCaskill, no.
Okay. Are there any senators wishing to vote or to change their vote? If not, on this motion to table, the ayes are 77, the nays are 20. The motion is agreed to.
Laid on the table.
Without objection. The clerk will read the bill for a third time.
Counter number 400, S3187, a bill to amend the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act to revise and extend the user fee programs for prescription drugs and medical devices and so forth and for other purposes.
Order. There will now be 2 minutes of debate equally divided prior to a vote on passage of the bill as amended.
Madam
The
President.
senator from Iowa.
You want to go first? Madam President, can we have some order, please?
Senators, please have order in the chambers.
Madam President, we have all put in a lot of work and benefited greatly by the constructive ideas and efforts of all the members of this body. I want to sincerely thank all of my colleagues, especially Senator Enzi, for their hard work on this must-pass legislation. This excellent bill is a shining example of what we can achieve when we all work together. Now we must keep our promise to patients and the biomedical industry and pass this critical bill. Today, with one vote, we can reauthorize the essential FDA user fee agreements, systematically modernize FDA's medical product authority, and help to boost American innovation and ensure that patients have access to the therapies they need. So I urge my colleagues to join in this bipartisan spirit of cooperation, pass this important legislation, the FDA Safety and Innovation Act.
Madam President,
The senator from Wyoming.
the chairman has said it well. We appreciate the bipartisan spirit in which people who have participated, especially in committee for a year and a half, working out amendments, working out ideas, coming up with a bill that had a good consensus. And I appreciate the action here on the floor, the people that were willing to do time limits on their amendments, and how quickly we've gotten through the votes. Particularly want to thank the chairman for the way that he's handled this in committee and in the process since then. We had a couple of issues that were outstanding. Those got worked out. I want to thank the staffs on both sides. Their dedication for a year and a half is what made this happen, and we have some outstanding staff on both sides. Every member of the committee and every committee member staff helped on this one, and that makes a difference. So I ask everyone to support the bill. Yield the floor.
The question is on passage of the bill as amended. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka, Mr. Alexander.
You go, sir.
Ms. Ayotte, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Begich, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Bingaman, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown of Massachusetts, Mr. Brown of Ohio, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Ms. Collins, Mr. Conrad, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Crapo, Mr. DeMint, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heller, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hutchison, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Inouye, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kerry, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Cole, Mr. Kyle, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Lautenberg, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Lieberman, Mr. Lugar, Mr. Manchin, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson of Nebraska, Mr. Nelson of Florida, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Snow, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Mr. Webb, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Akaka, Alexander, Ayotte, Barrasso, Baucus, Begich, Bennett, Bingaman, Blunt, Bozeman, Boxer, Brad of Massachusetts, Burr, Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Chambliss, Coates, Coburn, Cochran, Collins, Conrad, Corker, Crapo, Durbin, Enzi, Franken, Gillibrand, Graham, Grassley, Hagan, Harkin, Hatch, Heller, Hoven, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johans, Johnson of South Dakota, Kerry, Klobuchar, Cole, Landrieu, Lautenberg, Leahy, Lee, Lieberman, Lugar, Manchin, McConnell, Menendez, Merkley, Moran, Murkowski, Murray, Nelson of Nebraska, Nelson of Florida, Hall, Portman, Pryor, Reed of Rhode Island, Reed of Nevada, Roberts, Rockefeller, Schumer, Sessions, Stabenow, Tester, Thune, Toomey, Udall of Colorado, Udall of New Mexico, Vitter, Wicker, and Wyden. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein? Aye. Mrs. McCaskill. Mrs. McCaskill? Aye. Mr. Sanders voted in the negative. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warner? Aye. Mrs. Shaheen. Mrs. Shaheen? Aye. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cornyn? Aye. Mr. Webb. Mr. Webb? Aye. Ms. Snow. Ms. Snow? Aye. Ms. Mikulski? Ms. Mikulski? Aye. Mr. Kyle? Mr. Kyle? Aye. Mr. Whitehouse? Mr. Whitehouse? Aye. Mr. DeMint? Mr. DeMint? Aye. Mr. Coons? Mr. Coons? Aye. Mr. Rubio? Mr. Rubio? Aye. Mr. Inouye? Mr. Inouye? Aye. Mr. Risch? Mr. Risch? Aye. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, aye. Mr. McCain. Mr. McCain, aye. Mr. Brown of Ohio, aye. Mr. Shelby, aye. Mr. Levin, aye.
Okay. Are there any senators wishing to vote or to change your vote? Seeing none, on S3187 as amended, the yeas are 96, the nays are 1. The bill as amended has passed.
Consider, lay that on the table.
Without objection.
Madam President.
The
we have
majority
order?
leader.
We have order.
Now, we have order, senators. Please take your conversations.
I know people are very anxious to move on, and I am too, but I have to say just a word. I've said in my own caucus how much I appreciate the cooperation of Senator Enzi. He is a fine senator. He and Senator Harkin have worked so well together in this. It's exemplary for what the rest of us should do. I appreciate very much the work they've done. I repeat, it's how we should get other work done. This is an important piece of legislation, and we made it look simple. It wasn't, but because of these two fine senators, we were able to get this done in a very short period of time and do good things for the American people.
Under the previous order, the Senate will proceed to S-2343, which the clerk will report.
Counter number 365, S-2343, a bill to amend the Higher Education Act of 1965 and so forth and for other purposes.
Under the previous order, there will be 10 minutes of debate equally divided and controlled between the two leaders or their designees.
Madam President.
The Republican leader.
Madam President, can we have order in the Senate?
The Republican leader.
Madam President, there's still a lot of murmuring going on.
Senators, please take your conversations off the floor of the Senate. The Republican leader.
Madam President, we're in a rather ridiculous staring contest, waiting for our Democratic friends to offer a proposal that can actually pass when we've already got one right in front of us. We've wasted actually 2 weeks on this student loan issue for no good reason. Neither I nor the ranking member have heard a word from the Democrats on how they propose to resolve the issue and actually prevent the interest rate from rising. As we learned earlier this week, the President doesn't seem to even talk to his committee chairman anymore. All of this suggests that the White House doesn't really want to solve the problem, that it would rather allow these rates to double in a few weeks so that we can run around all summer pointing the finger at those Republicans in the Senate. Now, I'd like to believe that's still not the case. We had a chance to talk to the President about this and other issues last week down at the White House. I'm convinced that he'd like to get a solution. Yet the fact of the matter is, all he'd have to do is simply pick up the phone and tell the Democratic leadership here that we'd like to get this done, and I'm pretty confident we could work it out. Unfortunately, we can't just wait around hoping the President's going to pick up the phone. College students can't wait either. They want us to resolve the issue now, and I know we can. So to move the ball forward, I would say to my colleague, Majority Leader, if he agrees with me, Senator Harkin and Senator Enzi just did a good job of coming up with a bipartisan solution to this FDA bill. I'm confident that they could do the same thing on the student loan issue. They are the chairman and the ranking member of the committee that oversees student loan legislation, so I have a lot of confidence in their ability to do it. So I'm going to proffer a consent agreement that would, I think, allow us to go forward. My colleague from Tennessee will take the balance of our time after I've concluded. I would ask consent that following the conclusion of the two scheduled votes on the student loan bill, which we're about to have, the next order of business be a Harkin-Enzi bill dealing with the issue of the current student loan rate, provided further that no motion to proceed to other items be in order unless agreed to by both leaders. Now, the purpose of this consent agreement that I've just proffered is to allow Senator Harkin and Senator Enzi to negotiate on this important issue, the increase in the student loan rates, and to keep the Senate focused on how to resolve this issue in a timely way before the rate goes up. The bill they would negotiate would be the next order of business, but it would also provide that both leaders could agree to allow the Senate to work on other measures, if necessary, as those student loan discussions continue.
Is there objection?
I'm going to use the leader time. 5 minutes were allocated. Mr. President, we've all heard of reverse engineering. What we just heard is reverse reasoning. This is one of the most interesting things I have heard that makes no sense. We have been trying to get on this bill for weeks. The Republicans have refused to allow us to get on the bill. Mr. President, the student loan issue is important. We should already have completed this had we been allowed to get on the bill, but we weren't allowed to get on the bill. We were faced with one of our many filibusters. Scores of them, not 1, 2, 3, or 4, scores of them. And this is another example of they've stopped us from legislating on a bill. Now to come here and say we could have been doing something, My friend knows the rules of this Senate as well as I do, and he knows his suggestion is absurd. I object.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President, on behalf of Senator Alexander, I call up amendment number 2153.
Clerk will report the amendment.
The Senator from Kentucky, Mr. McConnell, for Mr. Alexander and others, proposes amendment number 2153.
Mr. President,
Senator from Tennessee.
on July the 1st, for 7 million students getting new loans to go to college, the rate for interest will go from 3.4 to 6.8. This is an amendment to get a result. This is the House-passed bill. President Obama says he wants to freeze the rate for a year. Governor Romney says he wants to freeze the rate for a year. The House of Representatives has voted to freeze the rate for a year. A vote yes on the House-passed bill will permit us to send it to them. They quickly send it to the President. He signs it, and we've solved the problem.
Senator from Iowa.
Mr. President, while I appreciate the confidence the Republican leader has in Mr. Enzi and I's ability to get things done, quite frankly, we are confronted now with two votes. Which way do we want to go? What they are proposing is that we totally eliminate all of the prevention and wellness money that we have out there in the wellness fund. What would this do? We got vaccinations for children, immunizations, smoking cessation programs, hepatitis screening, colorectal screening, breast cancer screening, diabetes prevention, obesity prevention, all funded by this Prevention and Wellness Fund. They would, not one of those would be funded from that fund if that amendment passed. So the choice is very clear on the two amendments that we have coming up. We can either vote to close a tax loophole that allows wealthy tax dodgers not to pay their fair share of taxes. We can close that loophole and keep the interest rates at 3.4%, or, as the Republicans want to do, totally eliminate the Wellness and Prevention Fund and end the money that we're putting into diabetes prevention and breast cancer and colorectal screening and all the things I mentioned. I don't think the choice could be more clear to the American people about the direction we ought to go. Close the tax loophole, keep the prevention fund in there, keep our people healthy.
Mr. President.
Senator from Tennessee.
Mr. President, we have 2 minutes left. I'll use one of them. Our friends on the other side have their usual solution to almost any problem. Let's put some more taxes on small businessmen and women in America during a time of the greatest recession we have. We have a better idea for how to pay for this bill. We'll take some of the savings that the Congressional Budget Office said that our friends found when they took over the student health program in the health care bill. Instead of giving the students the benefit of those savings, they spent it on government. They spent $8.3 billion on the health care bill. So we'll give back to the students enough money to pay for this freezing of the rate. We won't tax the small business people. We'll have a little left over, and we'll reduce the debt. And then we can send our bill to the House. They'll pass it like that, send it to the President, and the problem's solved.
Mr. President. Mr. President.
The Senator from Rhode Island.
Mr. President, as Senator Harkin pointed out, the Republican proposal goes right to the heart of prevention, and that'll have two effects. It'll deny critical services to families all across this country, and it'll do something else. It will deny us the chance to bend that proverbial health care cost curve. If we do not control those costs, we'll be in a fiscal disaster. That measure they're proposing does not make sense. We have proposed to close a tax loophole that has been described by the Inspector General for the Tax Administration as a multi-billion-dollar employment tax shelter. We've restricted it to the people who are receiving over $200,000 a year. This is not small businessmen and women. This is not the corner hardware store. These are lobbyists. These are lawyers who have craftily used subchapter S corporations to avoid paying payroll taxes. This loophole has been criticized on the editorial pages of the Wall Street Journal. This is no just raise taxes. This is trying to find a loophole which has been criticized by the right as well as the left to pay for and ensure that we do not double the interest rates on students. I can't think of a clearer choice reject the Republican proposal, accept our proposal, do not allow student interest rates to rise on July 1st as they're scheduled to do.
Mr. President.
The Senate will be in order.
How much
Senator
time
from
is remaining?
Tennessee.
How much time is remaining?
1 minute and 20 seconds.
Mr. President, it's reassuring to me that my friend on the other side of the aisle is reading the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal. I'm sure that'll have some constructive benefit over the next several months. But here's the bottom line. A vote yes means a result.
The Senate will be in order.
This is the same as the House passed bill which freezes interest at 3.4% for a year. We send it to the House, down to the President, he signs it, the problem solved. And instead of raising taxes on small business people, we give back to students the money that they should have had the benefit of when the other side took over the entire health care, whole student loan program before. So if you want a result, please vote yes. If you want more debate and delay, vote no.
Mr. President.
Senator from Iowa.
The President has already said that if the Republican measure were to pass and send to him, he would veto it. That's a non-starter. A non-starter. Surely, my friend from Tennessee does not want to cut out all of this funding that we do for hepatitis screening, colorectal screening, diabetes prevention, vaccinations for our kids that are all funded. All of that would be ended by their amendment. I don't know what my friend's talking about in terms of student money and this and that. Their provision takes all this money out of the Prevention and Wellness Fund. That is not what we want. We don't want to keep our kids from getting vaccinations or hepatitis screening or diabetes prevention in order to keep the interest rates low. Let's close the tax loophole that's been talked about, that Senator Reid and both Senator Reids talked about. Close that tax loophole. Send it to the President. He'll sign it. That way we'll keep the interest rates down at 3.4% and not allow them to double on July the 1st.
The Senate will be in order. Who seeks recognition?
Is all time expired?
The minority has 35 seconds, and the majority 38.
Our case is so compelling, Mr. President, we'll give back the rest of our time.
Time
Yield
yielded.
back. Mr. President, time's been yielded back. We think there will be 2 more votes. I can't say there'll be no more votes. We have a few things to work out, like flood insurance. I think we're there, but I can't give everyone that assurance at this time.
The question is on the amendment offered by the senator from Kentucky. Is there a sufficient second?
There appears to be. There is.
There is. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka. Mr. Alexander. Ms. Ayotte. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Beckidge. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bingaman. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Brown of Massachusetts. Mr. Brown of Ohio. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Chambliss. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Mr. Conrad, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Dement, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heller, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hutchison, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Noway, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kerry, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Cole, Mr. Kyle, Ms. Landrieu,
No.
Mr. Lautenberg, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Lieberman, Mr. Lugar, Mr. Manchin, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson of Nebraska, Mr. Nelson of Florida, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Snow, Ms. Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Mr. Webb, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Ayotte, Blunt, Bozeman, Brown in Massachusetts, Coates, Cochran, Collins, Cornyn, Enzi, Graham, Grassley, Hatch, Heller, Hoban, Isaacson, Johanns, Kyle, Lugar, McCain, McConnell, Portman, Rubio, Sessions, Shelby, Thune, and Vitter. Senators voting in the negative: Akaka, Baucus, Beckich, Bennett, Bingaman, Boxer, Brown of Ohio, Burr, Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Coburn, Conrad, Corker, Dement, Feinstein, Franken, Gillibrand, Hagan, Harkin, Johnson, Wisconsin, Johnson, South Dakota, Klobuchar, Cole, Levin, Lieberman, Manchin, McCaskill, Menendez, Merkley, Mikulski, Moran, Murray, Nelson, Nebraska, Nelson of Florida, Pryor, Reed of Rhode Island, Reed of Nevada, Rockefeller, Sanders, Shaheen, Tester, Toomey, Udall of Colorado, and Udall of New Mexico. Mr. Leahy, no. Mr. Warner, no. Mr. Whitehouse, no. Mr. Wyden, no.
I'll call on you second.
Mr. Schumer, no. Ms. Stabenow, no. Mr. Lautenberg, no. Mr. Kerry. Mr. Kerry, no. Mr. Barrasso, aye. Mr. Roberts, aye. Mr. Crapo, aye. Mr. Chambliss, aye. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee, no. Mr. Webb, no. Mr. Wicker, aye.
Very good.
Mr. Paul, no. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Durbin, no. Mr. Coons, no. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Noe. Mr. Noe, no. Ms. Landrieu? No. Mr. Inhofe? No.
Are there any senators wishing to vote or change their vote? The Senate will be in order. Are there any senators wishing to vote or to change their vote? Seeing none on this vote, the yeas are 34, the nays are 62. One announced present. Under the previous order requiring 60 votes for the adoption of this amendment, the amendment is not agreed to. Majority Leader. The Senate will be in order.